The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Lisa White from the Colorado Municipal League, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you joining us today for this very interesting webinar on air, water, and gas. This is going to be an opportunity to learn about this group and some of the ways they can support municipalities statewide. So it's our pleasure to have them here, and it's a pleasure to have you here as well. So welcome. Those of you that are elected officials, you will receive one University training credit, and we will be recording, as always, today's presentation. It'll be under cml.org under the Training Materials tab, and we'll probably get it posted either later today or tomorrow. Therefore, if there's anything you want to hear about again or share the link with a colleague, you'll be able to do that. If you're not familiar with the webinar format, you'll see a control panel to the top right of the screen. You have an orange arrow to the left of the panel, which will minimize the entire box. All of you will be muted for the webinar, but we encourage you to ask questions by typing them into the question box on the control panel. We will take questions at the end, so feel free to save your questions until then. At this point, I'm just going to very quickly say who our speakers are. As you can see from that first screen on your computer, Joseph Ryan is a professor in the Department of Civil, Environmental, and Architectural Engineering at the University of Colorado Boulder. Tanya Heikkila, yes, is a professor and associate dean of faculty affairs at the University of Colorado Denver School of Public Affairs, where she is also co-director of the workshop on policy process research. Mike Hannigan is an associate professor and the chair of the Mechanical Engineering Department at the University of Colorado Boulder. And Catherine Muntz. Catherine, your work, let's see, how do I have to look at this here. She manages the project, all right, Catherine, you gotta help me, including developing the Intermountain Oil and Gas Best Management Practices Project, which she manages through National Resources LLC. A lot of incredible brain power in this room, folks, and so it's an absolute pleasure to turn it over to Joseph Ryan at this point, and it's a pleasure to have you.
Hi, I'm Joe Ryan. I'm going to get this started, give you a little overview, tell you who's talking about what, and make sure everybody's up to date on oil and gas and hydraulic fracturing. So I'm going to go to this first slide here, which has a nice picture of what hydraulic fracturing is about, and the fact that on top of that, we're also combining this with the technology of horizontal drilling. This is a good representation, gets into account the depth. In particular here in the Denver-Julesburg Basin, we're often talking about 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 feet, and some of that horizontal drilling might be going up to 2 or 3 miles now horizontally. Quite a technological breakthrough that lets this happen. This has been compared to a couple of food groups. We used to be able to get oil and gas out of the ground like a jelly donut, just put a straw in and the oil and gas would come out. But now it's a little bit more like this tiramisu, where the horizontal drilling allows extraction of a certain layer. The next slide here shows the state of Colorado and oil and gas wells, and each red dot is an oil and gas well, and you can see in many areas of the state of Colorado these are overlapping into what appears like oil and gas wells everywhere. Here's a representation from 1991 to 2013 of the accumulation of oil and gas wells in the Wattenberg field, which is in the Denver-Julesburg Basin in northeastern Colorado. And I'll let this run through one more time just to give you an idea of how quickly this boom has increased the number of oil and gas wells around. This only goes up to 2013 as well. This has resulted in a lot of oil and gas development near residential communities, and that's been the source of a lot of the concern about oil and gas development in Colorado. Here's what it looks like underground. This is from the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission's geographic information system, and the horizontal lines you see here are the paths of horizontal wells. The red dots are the wells, and this is near Platteville, Colorado, this particular, I'm sorry, it's actually a little bit north of Windsor, Colorado, this location. We were motivated to address this as a research problem, trying to make some decision between the pros and the cons. Some of the pros on the left side here in green, some of the cons on the right-hand side in red, of oil and gas development. How do you decide whether or not the pros outweigh the cons? Is this something that should move forward, or should we be regulating it to a greater extent? One of the complications of this is that a lot of these pros and cons are on national, even global levels, where you start talking about carbon emissions, but on the local level too, in terms of the air pollution, water pollution, potential land use disruption that's affecting people in those neighborhoods where the drill rigs are popping up in their backyards. This motivated us to put together a research team that's depicted in this slide, addressing oil and gas development in the Rocky Mountain region. And we really focused on Colorado because, as it turns out, Colorado has collected a lot of data about oil and gas development, and because most of the researchers on this team are from the state of Colorado. Most of the blue boxes there are different aspects of the science and engineering that we covered. And then in the upper left, we've got the practices and regulations group and an outreach and education group. And over on the upper right, we've got a data management effort as well. This was a 6-year project from the National Science Foundation. It involved 27 researchers, and to date, we've put out something like 70+ peer-reviewed publications. Here's a quick list of those different teams for your reference, and I'm not going to read these off, but just to let you know that they're here so you could go back and look at some of the issues that we've addressed for these different teams. So today, right after me, Tanya Heikkila is going to talk about some of the efforts of Colorado policy actors, people who have been involved in making decisions about oil and gas development. That's going to get followed up by Mike Hannigan, who's going to talk about some of the air quality issues. And then I will be back on to talk about some of the water quality and water use issues. And we're going to end it up with Catherine Mutz, who's going to focus on Memoranda of Understanding involving oil and gas operators and municipalities. All right, so from here we move on to Tanya Heikkila.
Hi everybody, this is Tanya, and I'm going to give you just a quick snapshot of some of the research I've been doing with Professor Chris Weibel and Kristen Olafson, one of our PhD students at the School of Public Affairs at CU Denver. And we're really focusing on the perceptions of policy actors or people who are actively involved in oil and gas development issues and policy in Colorado, and how that kind of shapes the conflicts that we've been seeing around oil and gas development. So the people that we're studying in our research, again, this is not the general public. These are people perhaps like those of you who are listening, who are affiliated with government, nonprofits, industry, even academia and media, but who have played a role in trying to influence policy decisions or who have been actively involved in this issue. We've done a lot of interviews, survey work, and media analysis on this topic, and I'm going to focus for today just on a few of the survey questions that we've done in 2015 and 2017. And you can see at the bottom of this slide the response rates that we got in for each of our surveys. And 2015, as you can see, had a slightly higher response rate, but 2017 we had a slightly higher number of respondents. So just to give you a quick summary of who these respondents were, you can see that it's spread across various organizational affiliations, but local governments actually make up a fairly sizable proportion of the respondents. They were about 30% of the respondents in 2015 and closer to 40% of the respondents to our survey in 2017. And just to give you a sense of how these respondents are perceiving oil and gas development, we asked a question on the survey: do you want oil and gas development stopped, limited, continued at the current rate, expanded moderately, or expanded extensively? And across the board, so looking at all of the survey respondents, a large proportion are either in the kind of continue group or in the limit group. And that was pretty consistent between 2015 and 2017 when we did the two surveys. For the rest of this presentation, I'm going to cluster those respondents into just three groups. So I'm going to cluster respondents into a limit or stop group, a continue at the current rate group, and an expand group. And to give you a sense of kind of where some of the different organizational affiliations were, well, this slide got a little goofy, but that's okay. I don't know where the labels went on the limit group, but that's all good. You can see that over time, the proportion of respondents across these different groups have changed slightly. And one thing I would highlight here is that the local government comprises a larger portion of each of these groups, of the stop, continue, and expand group between 2015 and 2017, because they were a larger proportion of the overall respondents. But within the local government group, what we see is that really between 2015 and 2017, the proportion of respondents who either want oil and gas development stopped or limited or continued or expanded remained somewhat stable between those 2 years. So about 40% between the 2 years in the stop or limit group, another 30% in the continue, and roughly 30% in the expand group. So going back to all of the respondents now, this isn't just local government. We asked respondents to tell us how strongly they agree with various perceptions of risk associated with oil and gas development. And those include issues like public nuisances, boom and bust economic cycles, air quality issues, government capacity to regulate, water contamination, and public health. Not surprisingly, if you want oil and gas development stopped or limited, you're more likely to agree that these are serious or important risks associated with oil and gas development. If you're in the continue or expand group, you're less likely to agree that these are serious risks. Similarly, we asked people about what are the benefits associated with oil and gas development on issues such as increased government revenue, national energy security, or reduced energy costs, those types of things. And similar patterns show up here, just in the opposite direction. So if you're someone who wants oil and gas development limited or stopped, you're less likely to agree that these are important benefits of oil and gas development. Certainly, if you want it expanded, you strongly agree that these are important benefits. Interestingly, though, we saw kind of a shift in some of these benefit perceptions between 2015 and 2017. So the expand group had slightly higher benefit perceptions in 2015, and as did the continue group than in 2017. Then we asked folks, over the past 2 years, have issues become worse, stayed the same, or gotten better? And we asked about things like the intensity of the political debate, economic benefits, government relations, protection of public health and the environment, and science and technical information. And just a quick couple things to note here. On the intensity of the political debate, regardless of your kind of core position on oil and gas development, everybody seems to agree that it's gotten worse. But on issues like science and technical information, pretty much everyone agrees that it's gotten better. On these other issues, though, if you want oil and gas development stopped or limited, you're likely to see like economic benefits, government relations, or public health as getting worse. Whereas if you think that it should be continued or expanded, you're likely to see them getting better. Although those issues, again, we saw some differences between 2015 and 2017 with kind of better perceptions about the outcomes in 2015. And then finally, we looked at the extent to which people might be willing to compromise on their policy positions under certain conditions. So, for example, if someone said they would want oil and gas development stopped or limited, we asked if they would be willing to support the expansion of it under certain conditions. And so those conditions included things like science shows it's completely safe. We don't see strong agreement here on any of these conditions, but where we see the strongest agreement is around whether Colorado adopts an energy plan that transitions away from fossil fuels, and also pretty strong agreement on more authority to give into local governments or science shows that it's safe. So more, I guess, more neutral agreement on those than disagreement. Conversely, we asked folks who want to see oil and gas development continued or expanded, would they be willing to see limits or the end of oil and gas development under certain conditions? And again, no one has strong agreement on these issues. They're pretty set in their positions. But those areas where they are more likely to agree are on if science shows that it's unsafe or if mineral rights owners are compensated for their losses. So just to sum up here, again, the policy actors, those people that we surveyed in this study who are, from various organizations, nonprofits, industry, governments, they're relatively split on their positions on oil and gas development, and local governments are representative of that division. In terms of the risk and benefit perceptions, we see that those are strongly correlated with one's position on oil and gas development, but we see some agreement that public nuisances are a serious risk and government revenues are a major benefit. On the outcomes, while most agree that science has improved, it's interesting to note that the intensity of the political debate is perceived to be worse. So a lot of people say, oh, we just need more information and we can address these conflicts, but sometimes more information actually can exacerbate conflicts or people can use that information to reinforce their policy positions. However, those who want to see oil and gas development continued or expanded at least saw better outcomes in 2015 than 2017, which suggests the importance of kind of political and economic context driving some of these perceptions. And then finally, on the willingness to compromise, we see some fairly rigid positions on this issue, but perhaps there could be some paths forward toward more concord if Colorado adopts an energy plan that transitions away from fossil fuels, if we continue to invest in better science, and create some strategies for compensating mineral rights holders if we do limit oil and gas development. Our next steps in terms of the research team on the policy conflicts is to unpack these local oil and gas conflicts a little more, delving into our interviews. We've done some on some of these hotspots in Colorado recently, and also our media analyses. And then we're going to compare some of the results from this study to work we're doing across the US on other types of energy infrastructure development issues and also oil and gas across other states. And then finally, we're going to continue to do some outreach on this issue, providing recommendations and convening stakeholders on how to mitigate conflicts around energy issues. Chris Weibel and I have done some of this already in various settings, and if those of you who are listening today are interested in chatting with us about that, we're happy to engage, so feel free to contact us. All right, I'm going to pass it off to Mike.
Hello, this is Mike. Thanks, Tanya. So I get the honor of presenting about lots of people's work here on the air quality issues associated with oil and gas. And I just to name the folks you can see on the slide, Gabby Petrone is a scientist at NOAA, Jana Milford is a faculty member at University of Colorado, and Greg is a researcher at NRO. And so this is work, a lot of the work is from them and as well as other teammates. So we're going to start off with kind of probably the most obvious direct problem associated with oil and gas issues, air quality problem, excuse me. And so, one of the motivations behind this move to natural gas from coal in terms of electricity generation is that natural gas emits half the carbon dioxide per unit of energy. And so there's some obvious benefits to climate if we switch from coal to natural gas. The tricky part about that switch is that methane, which is 90% of natural gas, is also a greenhouse gas. And so if the switch from coal to natural gas also involves some leaking of methane as part of that natural gas cycle, then we might have problems. And so there has been a lot of work nationally to try to understand this trade-off between the fuel switch and the leaking of methane associated with natural gas. And so I just wanted to bring this up as one of the higher level topics. And you can see on the slide that methane is 84 times more efficient at trapping heat than carbon dioxide. So a little bit of methane leaking from the natural gas system will be an issue in terms of climate. And so there's been a bunch of work by EDF, actually, with scientists from across the country to try to dig deeper into the leak rates that are currently happening. And they found a lot of variability across different oil and gas basins, all the way from Pennsylvania to Texas to California and to Colorado as well. And they figured out that about 1.7% of the methane that we're using in the natural gas cycle for energy delivery is leaking in the from production to use. And so that is a big enough chunk that it does cause some issues with the trade-off of CO2 loss, reduced CO2 associated with coal. So I just wanted to bring this up as an important piece. And you're going to see lots of further work happening, I think, on trying to mitigate this methane loss. Locally, there was a study in the Denver-Julesburg Basin where they're trying to kind of figure out the relative strength of this methane leaking compared to other methane sources. And so this is work by Gabby Patron's group. And I just wanted to point out this was an interesting study. There's some numbers there, but in general, it's showing that, let's say, the average leak rate is 20 from the methane. And then there's about 6 or 7 coming from landfills, animals, municipal waste. And this is in, again, Weld County, which is very agricultural. So it just gives you kind of the scale of the importance of this methane leaking problem. There's more work to be done here. The EDF has also tried to figure out what part of the industry is actually causing or is associated with some of this leaking. And so this is a hard to read figure. I'm sorry, but it helps me explain to you what's happening. They've tried to look at all the way from the well to the end use, where is the methane leaking from? And they found that a big chunk happens in that first production phase. You can see the darker blue, larger bar there is called pneumatic valves, under pneumatic valves. And it turns out there's valves in industry where they actually are purposely releasing methane because they don't want pressure to build up in the pipes. So it's a safety issue. And so that purposeful release then goes to the atmosphere and causes some issues. There's some engineering solutions to that, and there is definitely work happening to try to reduce that problem. They've also found that where Professor Ryan showed a lot of the underground pipes, but there's also a lot of overground pipes on where all that methane and natural gas is getting piped to. And it turns out in a lot of places where their pipes are meeting and joining and moving on, there's pumps and there's pumps and equipment there, and there's also leaking happening there. And there's a lot of work then moving on to kind of understand that other large, big blue arrow there to figure out how to deal with that. So the point is that there's some leaking. People are trying to identify it to fix the problem and reduce those methane leaking numbers. In addition to kind of Environmental Defense Fund doing a lot of work at the kind of national scale, there's also been a lot of technology development happening so that industry and communities can start to kind of understand these problems for themselves. And that big piece of that is trying to figure out how to build tools that are lower cost and reliable. And so I'm just showing a couple of example technologies here. On the left side is a technology that's coming out of our work on this grant. That's really low cost sensor development from my group, where we can put a tool out and can try to look for leaks, for methane specifically leaks around a facility in a community, and at the price point of more like $500. And then on the right, I'm showing you kind of a really high-tech way of using a frequency comb laser, which is fun to say, a technique of trying to use a way of scanning different pathways and having one tool that can examine leaking across the whole basin. And there's a lot of active research and technology development happening around these areas. So as local folks, you probably will start to see these technologies coming out and maybe giving you all some tools to think about measurements. Again, this is methane focused specifically, though. One of the other problems associated with the air problems associated with this development is not just the methane, but some of the other heavier compounds that have come along with the methane. And this is especially true in areas where you're getting oil and gas, and so some of the heavier parts that are associated with the oil side tend to be known as air toxics. And so air toxics, we often think of the most common one as benzene. So you probably have all heard of that. And so we've been trying to do a lot of measurements on benzene in these oil and gas development areas. And there is a part of our team who's not here today, Lisa McKenzie and John Adgate, who have been working on kind of health impacts associated with potential exposure to these kinds of air toxics. And I don't want to steal Lisa's work on this, but they're finding out there's some important there's potentially important health impacts associated with these exposures. That more to think about on this. What I'm just showing you is a time series of benzene measurements in Platteville around in 2014 that just shows a dashed line that's the minimum risk level from benzene. That's like an 8-hour exposure though, so don't get too worried here. But there's definitely a lot of measurements of high benzene levels around in Platteville around some development efforts. And again, there's a lot of benzene comes from multiple sources, so you can't just fingerprint, say it's one thing when you see these benzene emissions. You have to kind of figure out what's happening. So there's a lot of science and research happening, and that's the upper right slide is to remind me that we often look at pollutant ratios to help us think through where certain compounds are coming from. It's our detective work, you can think of it that way. And so the upper right corner is showing us that there seems to be two different sources or two different ratios of toluene to benzene. One happens to be motor vehicles, and the other happens to be condensate tanks that are part of that oil extraction effort associated with natural gas and oil. And so using that kind of approach, Gabby Petrolin's group, again, was able to look at the Denver-Julesburg Basin and figure out that roughly half the benzene is coming from cars and half is coming from condensate tanks. And so there's still more work to be done on this. There's just been a little bit of study on these air toxics, and again, this is an area that probably for locals will be a big issue, thinking about kind of the local community exposures. And we can get back to that again in a minute. The third problem that is the least direct problem is this idea of ozone. And so you guys have probably all heard of ozone. It's a federal regulated pollutant. There's huge health impacts associated with ozone. So I'm giving you a little slide of ozone in the how it's formed in the left. Sorry for the chemical reactions, I can't resist. There's 3 reactions there. You can see NO2 plus sunlight equals NO plus this cool oxygen called O singlet D, which just means it's a powerful O atom that likes to combine with O2 in the atmosphere to form ozone. And then ozone is destroyed with combining with NO. So that's a closed loop cycle, we like to think of it. The thing is, if you add like a VOC like benzene, for instance, back into it, the benzene competes with that third reaction so that you don't get as much destruction of ozone as you would normally. So if you have, the point of this story is if you have sunlight, NO and NO2, and VOCs, you're going to get high ozone levels. And so we're always trying to figure out what's causing these high ozone levels. And so NO and NO2 come often from diesel generators and diesel trucks and diesel vehicles. You're going to find VOCs to come from lots of places, but in particular, we're caring about, in this case, caring about VOCs associated with oil and gas development. And I'm just showing on the right, showing that people recently from our team have figured out that a good chunk of ozone associated with ozone violations in the Greeley area are coming from VOCs linked with the oil and gas development. I mean, it's not solely responsible, but it's a big piece of the story, and it's important to keep moving forward to understand. So what are we doing about this ozone? Again, so ozone's a state level thing we often think about because it's a federal mandated pollutant. So the state has to come up with an implementation plan on how to work on this. And so what we're doing inside our project is to try to understand, what changes to the energy system will impact, how will it impact ozone? And so what I'm showing you on the left is energy generation profiles. This work is from Jana Milford. And it's basically just showing you in 2030, what will our energy mix be? I know it's hard to read, but you can think of that green slice in the middle as natural gas. And the blue on the top is wind. And those are where you're seeing the big trade-offs. And so you see in the first bar as the base scenario, the second bar is cheap gas. So if gas gets cheaper, you'll see more gas being used for electricity generation. And if you see gas gets more expensive, which is the next bar, you'll see wind grow. And if you get all the way to having greenhouse gas fees associated with these emissions, you'll see wind grow even larger. And the whole point of this is we're able to take that kind of a modeling effort and then use it to project emissions, which is on the right side. And you can see that in the right side, again, you can't see this, it's hard, a lot going on. The point is that as we implement either costly gas or greenhouse gas fees, we can see reductions in NOx emissions as well as we're going to see reductions in VOC. So we will likely see impacts on ozone. So it's really important for us to kind of think forward as we're doing this and to understand these scenarios. Okay, last thing before I stop here is, so what can communities and individuals and local municipalities do? Well, certainly, besides ozone, a lot of the monitoring is not regulated. So you have to understand benzene or methane. You have to kind of do a lot of it yourself. And so I'm just showing you here as our group has done some work on trying to even understand, to use low-cost tools to even understand what are the benefits to some of the trade-offs between natural gas and coal, and how important that is to think about. And we, as our research team, has actually started to use some of these sensors with schools to try to help school kids also understand the trade-offs associated with different energy scenarios. And we, in the past, have been talking to the city of Longmont to help them implement some of these sensors to explore some of the energy problems in the city of Longmont. Again, so these are research tools that we're trying to figure out how to use with the regulatory community. So this is kind of a fun place for us to be in as well. And I also want to mention that the state of California has recently passed a very cool, okay, I shouldn't say that, as a researcher who likes to build new tools, they've recently passed a state bill that is mandating a lot of monitoring in communities that are near oil and gas development. And it's kind of driving a lot of technology innovation too, and trying to empower communities to kind of do some of this monitoring themselves. I think that offers some potential for us to all to look at. And I'm going to definitely go over the time there, and I'm going to pass off to Joe Ryan.
Okay, I'm back again. And before I start, I just want to mention that Mike Hannigan also led our research network's efforts in education and outreach. And just to give you a couple of examples of that, we're headed to Paonia and Delta later this week for a couple of science fairs that the outreach team sponsored. And over the past year or so, as we've strived to not just get our results out in terms of peer-reviewed publications, we've also been trying to speak with, meet with, and talk to community groups, municipalities, and so on. We've done this for Broomfield in Lafayette. We've got one coming up in Boulder, and we'd welcome your inquiries about any interest you might have in a more focused session at your location. Okay, so I'm going to switch from air to water here and tell you a little bit about some of the work we've done on water quality and quantity. This is the EPA's representation of the aspects of water that we should be worried about, and this was in a report that they put out a couple of years ago. So the first step here is this water acquisition. Our research team up at Colorado State, Reagan Wascom leading this team, this representation here is from the left side to the right side. It shows the total amount of water withdrawn in Weld County. And then the middle bars, the red and the yellow, you've got surface water, about 95.5% of that water. And then the uses on the right-hand side, and you can see agriculture is about 90% of that use. And then on the far right, you got the oil and gas use. 1% of the water in Weld County is used for oil and gas development. And that's mostly used for the hydraulic fracturing. The state put out data that said, up in the text in the upper right here, that water use across the whole state in all the counties, oil and gas producing or not, was about 0.1% for oil and gas. You can see in Weld County it's 10 times higher, 1%. Another way of looking at this is to say that that 1% is about 10% of the non-agricultural water. And that's makes it a little bit, gives you some numbers to see where this water is coming from and how we make decisions, especially if we run into any years where our water supply is limited. Here's the same graph, by the way, for Garfield County, our other big oil and gas producing county, not including the Raton Basin and the San Juan Basin down in the south, the coal bed methane. Here, Garfield County water, oil and gas use is about 2%, and it's about 27% of the non-agricultural water. Second step that the EPA looked at was this chemical mixing. And here we were interested in, and a lot of people made a big fuss over the fact that there were a lot of hazardous or toxic chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing fluid, and what would be the potential risk that these would get into our groundwater in some way. We took the approach a little bit differently. Instead of just looking at the hazardous compounds, we looked at the ones that didn't break down very fast They're the persistent ones, and the ones that would actually move along with the groundwater and not get stuck to the sediments. And the overlap of hazardous, persistent, and mobile were the ones we should really be paying attention to. So here, this is a graph of the x-axis is the mobility, how fast the compounds moved, and the ones that moved the fastest are on the left. And then we have this persistence. The ones that break down the slowest are at the top. So in the upper left-hand corner, we got the compounds that we really should be paying the most attention to. So out of the 659 organic compounds that have been used in oil and gas in hydraulic fracturing, only 19 of them are in that upper left corner there, and only 5 of them are frequently used. That's a good, much smaller number to focus on. But one of the issues is that of those 19 and of those 5, we don't routinely measure any of them. So this is something that can be used in terms of regulation. In fact, Broomfield decided to take this list and use this as a way of stating that oil and gas operators in Broomfield should not use these chemicals. Next step here is well injection, and under this we have the issue of methane potentially showing up in somebody's drinking water. As you can see in the picture in the upper left, one of the infamous photos of somebody who can light their tap water on fire. Here I got a quick summary of this one. Here's a map that shows where methane showed up in water wells in the Denver-Julesburg Basin, or more focused in the Wattenberg Field, which is north of Denver, and basically in southwestern Weld County is the real focus here. The red dots are where methane was determined to be thermogenic using carbon isotope data, and that's the methane that is believed to actually come from the deep oil and gas layers. So the numbers on the left, out of 924 well water samples shown there, 261 of them had methane above a concentration of 1 milligram per liter, and 42 of those had this methane that's believed to have come from oil and gas. That's 4.5%. That's a good number to know if you're trying to say, what's the likelihood that a water well, a private water well that somebody's using for irrigation or drinking water, gets affected by nearby oil and gas development. Here's the state's Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission's map showing water wells across the whole state. Altogether, there's about 6,000 or 7,000 water samples, and each data point there can be clicked on and you can get a result. It's a very nice system. We also, in addition to methane, we looked at the occurrence of benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylenes, or BTEX. And as Mike mentioned for air, benzene is also a concern in water as well. This map shows, similarly, on the left-hand side is the whole Denver-Julesburg Basin. You can see Wyoming up at the top, and Kansas and Nebraska off to the east. And then on the right-hand side, we zoom in again to the Wattenberg Field area. And the red dots are where the BTEX compounds occurred at higher than their detection limits. Go back. A number to get out of this one was we got something like 1,585 water wells sampled. 51 water wells were affected by benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, or xylenes, or 3.2%, and only about 0.4% were actually above concentrations that are considered hazardous for drinking water. We tied the occurrence of both the methane and the BTEX compounds into a common problem, at least in the cases where there had been some sort of culprit oil and gas well found. And the common problem was that the surface casings were short relative to water wells that were put in to deeper depths later in time. So if you go back to mid-1990s, there was not much drilling of water wells down to the current depths, which in the Denver-Julesburg Basin were going down to 700 feet or so to get water now. And the surface casings used to be quite a bit shorter than that. And so that's a problem this problem is attributed mostly to old oil and gas wells, not the new ones. Lastly, I got something here on flowback and produced water, another EPA issue. And this graph right here shows, first of all, the number of spills as a function of time from 2007 to 2014. And then on the right-hand axis, we've got how much oil and gas production has occurred and also produced water production. So the black line going across the graph is the number of spills. And you can go back to the early part, it's 150, 200 or so. And in 2013 and 2014, it was up to about 350, 400 spills a year. Seems like a lot of spills. If you normalize it, though, to the amount of oil and gas production, which is the yellow line, you can see that the number of spills is tied in fairly closely to the amount of oil and gas that's getting produced. And this is for the Denver-Julesburg Basin again. So here's some numbers to get out of this study. First of all, the number of spills per amount of oil produced has actually decreased over that time span. The number of spills that affect groundwater has decreased from about 54% to 27%. There's a lot of vigilance for spills to get them cleaned up quickly before they get down to groundwater. And one encouraging number, of 1,700 plus spills, only 3 of them actually reached somebody's water well. So there's 0.17%, another number to get out of this part of the talk here. So there's some numbers on water quality, and with that, I'll pass this off to Catherine Mutz, who's going to talk about Memoranda of Understanding and wrap it up for us.
Well, thank you, Joe. So I am the last speaker of this group talking about the Air, Water, and Gas project and the research that we've been doing. As Joe mentioned earlier, I'm with the Practices and Regulations group, and we were closely tied to the Outreach and Education group for the beginning years of the project and have morphed a little bit since then, but we really do think of our role as mostly an educational role as part of this project. I've worked my background is as a biologist and an attorney, and I worked on various energy issues over the years, starting with oil shale and moving to coal and then finally to oil and gas. And with the oil and gas, I've mostly worked with or developed the projects that I've been working on with the Getchis-Wilkinson Center, Natural Resources Law Center, Getchis-Wilkinson Center at the law school at CU. So while I'm billed as a Natural Resources LLC, I've been mostly associated with CU as part of my work. And so who is the Practices and Regulations group? It's myself and a couple of other attorneys from CU Law School, Matt Samuelson and Matt Sura. And then we've also had a number of contract attorneys working with us, a number of CU law students, and then also undergraduates from both CU and DU working on various aspects of our project. And our work with Air, Water, and Gas has actually been in conjunction with the Intermountain Oil and Gas BMP project that I'm in charge of and developed at Getchis-Wilkinson Center. And that project, I just wanted to mention, has been funded in part by the NSF work of the Air, Water, and Gas project, but also by CU Outreach. It helps us get information out to different parts of the Colorado community, the Rocky Mountain Mineral Law Foundation, the Colorado Energy Office, and then also some DOE funding from Research Partnership to Secure Energy for America and the Environmentally Friendly Drilling Group that kind of coordinates projects from DOE. So we've been working on a variety of issues. So what we do in the Practices and Regulations group, again, it's coordinated a bit through the Intermountain Oil and Gas BMP project, but we've had a number of different sub-projects that we undertook to provide resources to local governments, communities, industry, environmental groups. One of these is the Law Atlas Comparative Law Database, where we're comparing water quality, water quantity, and air quality rules and regulations for oil and gas development in a database that lets people compare them and see how they might, for example, modify their own regulations based on what other entities have done. The MOU project, which I'll talk mostly about today, is another project that we initiated because we thought we could provide some information to local communities and to industry as well on the MOUs that have been used to give a more local management of oil and gas development. And as part of that project, I'll talk a little bit about our website and the databases we've developed. We also did a stakeholder assessment where we did some interviews with local governments, industry folks, state government, and also some environmental folks to find out how they, who had experience with MOUs, thought that they were working, whether they were difficult to negotiate or not, what some of the important components of those are. And that's available on our website. And then last December, we had a workshop focusing on the MOUs and other regulatory options. So land use zoning, land use permitting, that kind of thing. Had about 60 local government representatives in a room for a full day, kind of hashing it out in terms of the value of MOUs versus other options. Our Practices and Regulations group also tries to make policy connections between the air, water, and gas researchers and some of the policy actors that Tanya mentioned earlier. Those can be local government folks, COGCC, other community folks, and Matt Sura and Samuelson have tried to make some appointments and set up some meetings. And Joe mentioned some of these a little bit earlier as examples of what Air, Water, and Gas has done in this regard. So our MOU project, this is the web page that we have that kind of lays out the resources that we have on the MOU project, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the individual components of it. So in terms of an anatomy of an MOU, we talk a little bit about what is an MOU, its evolution in Colorado from 2005 when La Plata County was the only entity having MOUs with oil and gas operators until 2017, last year when Broomfield did its latest MOU. These documents have morphed from very specific road and traffic related local agreements to very comprehensive agreements that deal with all aspects of oil and gas and how oil and gas affects the community, and makes agreements with the industry on how it will be done on a local basis. We talk a little bit about negotiations of MOUs, and then talk about kind of the different components of MOUs, and that includes administrative clauses of the documents, but also what we call substantive elements, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. And then really the heart of the MOU, which is the best management practices. As part of our work, we've created a database of MOUs. It's a catalog of MOUs that we're adding to as new ones come out. And if you go to our database and find that there are documents there that we're missing, we'd very much be interested in including them. But the database is searchable by local government, by operator, and so you can find out who's developing what and who's agreed to what in which communities. There's a how-to guide on our webpage so that you can know how to do a search. And then we provide a PDF documents of all of the MOUs, both ones that have expired and also current ones, to give a sense of how they've developed over the years. We also provide what we call an elements table, which compares some of the, not the BMPs of the documents, but some of the important aspects of them. And this table gives you kind of a general idea of, we've taken 3 or 4 of them and just shown examples of how the different communities either are similar or vary in terms of these elements. For example, if you just look at the green elements, that's access to facilities for inspections. Some of the communities have language in their MOUs that provide for this, and some of them provide for it only with notice or without notice to the operator. Another example is the red BMPs to be incorporated in COGCC permits, and that's a way that the communities and the operators are specifying that they want the COGCC to help enforced the MOU, and therefore the best management practices are incorporated in the permit itself. So there are a variety of other substantive elements that we compare from one document to the other. The database of BMPs from MOUs is kind of the heart of our project. So we've taken all of the individual MOUs and taken the BMPs in those documents and put them in a database so that they are also searchable by both keyword and category. Category in terms of air quality, water quality, wildlife, cultural resources, whatever. And keyword, if you want to know what the BMPs are that different communities use for pipelines or for VOC control or for electrification of equipment used on the website, you can find it by searching the BMP database. And then we've also done some of that searching ourselves and made a comparison table. So looked at how the different communities vary from community to community and how those compare to what the COGCC regulates. Because some of the MOUs actually duplicate what the COGCC requires at the state level and just specify it in their document. So that's essentially one example from the practices and regulations group of how we hope we have a resource that will be useful to you if you're considering doing an MOU, for example, with the website and the databases. Hopefully the stakeholder assessment, you can learn from your colleagues in how they've developed their MOUs and some of the problems that they've had. We may or may not have another workshop in the future. So those are the things that we've done in our particular group. Again, Joe and the other speakers have mentioned some of the outreach meetings or outreach activities that the air, water, and gas researchers have done on a more a broader level. NSF funding for this project ends this year. But the researchers are going to, all of our researchers are going to continue our work, and we hope that we'll have the opportunity to share that continuing work with communities, both the local governments and members of the community, hopefully helping you and your communities to understand what the issues are, but also to understand what the research that folks have done says about the trade-offs between the benefits and liabilities of oil and gas development. So we hope that this is a first step in that regard. And this is a slide gives the email contact information of the speakers today, but it also gives a link to the Air, Water, and Gas website where we've got all of the researchers listed, including in their different projects. And you can hopefully find someone that you might be interested in talking to and having work with your community. And now I'm going to turn it back to Lisa.
Yes, thank you.
And she can see if there are any questions.
Great, thank you so much. Wonderful information. Certainly hope that everyone enjoyed that presentation. And at this point, if you have any questions, we would love to entertain them now. Again, just type them into the question box and we'll certainly get those answered as they come in. At this point, I also have to remind you about our annual conference coming up, June 19th through 22nd in Vail. Hope you're planning to be there. Currently, registration is open. Just go to cml.org under annual conference and all of the information you need will be there. So I'm not seeing any questions, so that was a pretty thorough presentation, folks. We'll give it another second or two. Awesome. As a reminder, we will post this presentation to the website, cml.org. And if you're elected officials and you registered, you will get that credit for participating. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any questions. So with that, and feel free at all times to reach out directly to our presenters. They're happy to answer any questions you think about offline as well. So at that point, I want to thank you all for participating and hope you have a wonderful afternoon.